All right, we're going to dive into this really incredible story that's kind of tucked away in the resurrection accounts. It's all about how two super specific, super private meetings actually became the bedrock for the entire early church. It's fascinating.
So, let's kick things off with a question that might just catch you off guard. When you think about Jesus' first appearance after the resurrection, what do you picture? Probably that scene in the locked room with all the disciples, right? Well, the actual accounts, they tell a slightly different story.
And then there's this other piece of the puzzle. I mean, the complete 180 this guy does, it's one of the most powerful, but honestly most overlooked proofs for the resurrection you'll ever find. So we're going to dig into who he was and why his story is just so important.
First up, we've got Peter. Now, this is a story most of us think we know, right? But we're going to look at it from a totally different angle. This isn't just about failure and forgiveness. No, this is about a strategic restoration, specifically for a leadership role.
Okay, but first, we really have to feel the weight of this moment. I mean, this was not a small mistake. This wasn't a little slip-up. For Peter, the guy who called himself the Rock, this was a complete and total meltdown under pressure. A public, absolutely soul-crushing denial.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The Bible is almost silent about what happened next. Both Luke and Paul confirm it. They say Jesus appeared to Peter privately first, before almost anyone else. But they give us zero details, none. And that silence speaks volumes, doesn't it? It suggests an encounter that was so personal, so deep, that it was just for Peter. This was the start of his comeback, and it happened behind closed doors.
But what started in private had to be made official in public. So a little later, by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus says something amazing. He asks Peter 3 times if he loves him, directly addressing Peter's 3 public denials. And each time Peter says yes, Jesus gives him a commission. He is turning Peter's greatest failure into the very foundation of his new mission.
So you see what's happening here? This is so much more than just, hey, I forgive you. This was a reauthorization. This was Jesus in front of the other disciples, publicly handing the keys back to Peter and saying, you're still my guy. Your authority is reinstated. And wow, did it work. The effect was immediate. This restored, recommissioned Peter is the one who stands up at Pentecost and preaches with this incredible boldness. He basically becomes the tip of the spear for the whole mission of the church. First to the Jews, and then, in a move that shocked everyone, to the non-Jewish world, the Gentiles.
So the big takeaway here is this. Jesus wasn't just fixing a broken heart. He was forging a leader. The private meeting, the public questions, it was all an intentional, deliberate preparation for the huge spiritual authority Peter was about to use.
Okay, now let's pivot to our second pillar. And honestly, this story is even more surprising. We're talking about James, the half-brother of Jesus.
Now, this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but for the 3 years Jesus was doing his public ministry, his own family, including James, thought he was crazy. James literally grew up with Jesus, but he was a skeptic. He was on the outside looking in, totally unconvinced.
So the change in James after the resurrection is just mind-blowing. He goes from being a non-believing family member to becoming arguably the most important leader in the home-based church in Jerusalem. He's the guy who presides over its first big council meeting, and he even writes a book of the New Testament. So how on earth does a change that drastic even happen?
Well, here we go again. The answer is a private meeting. In our earliest written source, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he just states it as a fact. The risen Jesus appeared privately to James. Think about that. This meeting wasn't to restore a follower who failed, like with Peter. This was to convert a skeptic who doubted. It was a meeting that literally created a pastor out of an unbeliever.
And this just brilliantly shows how Jesus was equipping a totally different kind of leader for a different, but just as vital role. For Peter, that restoration process led to his apostolic authority to go out. For James, a personal revelation led to a stable, powerful pastoral leadership to stay home.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit, because these 2 incredibly important private meetings, they weren't just random events. They were part of a much bigger, much more purposeful series of appearances.
See, it wasn't just Peter and James. There was this whole wave of witnesses. Jesus appeared to individuals overcome with grief, like Mary Magdalene. He appeared to small groups walking on a road. He even appeared to a huge crowd of over 500 people at the same time. The key thing to see here is that none of this was random. These were not haphazard encounters.
Every single one of these meetings had a custom-fit purpose. For Mary, it was about comfort. For Thomas, it was about tangible proof to get him past his doubt.
For the disciples on the mountain, it was about giving them a global mission. Each appearance was perfectly designed to produce exactly what that person or that group needed at that moment.
And this is so cool. In the oldest written account that we have, the Apostle Paul lists out the witnesses, but he doesn't list them chronologically. He organizes them like a lawyer laying out a legal case. He starts with Peter, the chief apostle, to establish authority. And he makes a special point to include James, basically saying, hey, this resurrection was so powerful, it even convinced a close family member who was a total skeptic.
So, what does it all mean? What happens when we put these two unique, private meetings side by side? Well, what you see is the actual blueprint for the leadership of the early church.
And this really brings it all home. Peter, whose failure was loud and public, was restored to lead the church's mission outward to the entire world. And James, whose unbelief was quiet and private, was converted to provide stable, pastoral leadership inward at the very heart of the church in Jerusalem. You've got the engine for expansion and the anchor for stability, and both were put in place through a personal encounter with the risen Jesus.
Which leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to chew on. The two men Jesus personally handpicked to build his church were a catastrophic failure and a family skeptic. It just goes to show you that the very things we might see as disqualifications, our biggest failures, our deepest doubts, could be the exact raw materials that are meant to be transformed into our greatest purpose.